let's take a look. I am human and therefore indifferent to nothing done by humans. Okay, so let's take a look at moral relativism. So according to this view, our values are determined by the society we grow up in, and there is no universal values. This is kind of the position you guys took a little bit this morning, that depended on where you grew up, there was no universal, okay? Moral values are simply customs or conventions that vary culture to culture. In some ways, you guys took that position today. You said it was a matter of convention. The words ethics and the words morality are both derived from words that originally meant custom, okay? So customs dictate things like which side of the street we drive on, right? And what foods we eat and what sort of holidays we practice. So some societies are even allow polygamous relationships, right? More than one wife or more than one husband. And others require a monogamous relationship where you're only allowed to have one husband and one wife. Some societies bury their dead, some burn their dead, okay? The two main arguments for moral relativism are based on a couple things. One is called the diversity argument. It states that the variety of moral practices of all the different societies in the world now and in world history state that there is no such thing as objective moral values. Kind of the position you guys took, that there is no sort of universal, although that not stealing one that you guys came up with, maybe that is one objective moral value. You have to select the one called B5 color. That's the printer, okay? So these do not seem to reflect any sort of serious differences in values, but you don't have to look hard to find practices within different cultures, even anthropological cultures, right, that have confirmed that societies have engaged in practices that we would find morally wrong, like slavery, female genital mutilation, burning widows on funeral pyres of their husbands. When the husband died, you burn the widows with the husband. Cannibalism. We would definitely find most of these, I would hope all of you would find all of these morally wrong, yet at the time, they were a custom of that society, okay? So all these diverse practices would be an argument that morality is relative. It's relative to the society in which you grow up and the age in which you grow up, okay? And that might be a good argument, because we would say, no, I'm not going to engage in slavery, that's barbaric, right? But at the time, people did not see anything wrong with that behavior. Take a more modern example, like smoking in public places, okay? At the time when I was growing up, that was just part of the practice. Now, for you guys, this is just seen as morally wrong, right? So the second argument is the lack of foundations argument, which says that there seems to be no grounding to moral sort of standings. Like there's no sort of basic precept behind this. There's no argument that we can test this against. It's not like sciences where we have a basic axiom that we can test our theory against. That in morality, this is not the case, that it's just sort of something that humans have invented, okay? Now, this still might be a tough position to hold. So in other areas, we might appeal to some of our ways of knowing, like reason or perception, but even those don't seem to help us when we're dealing with moral issues, okay? What we're going to be moving towards here is this, try to get away from an is statement to an ought statement. The ought statement, which is something that David Hume, a philosopher, came up with, was it's a moral standpoint, not a sort of scientific standpoint, okay? So here's a syllogism you may remember from last year. Some people in the world are starving. I have more food than I need. Therefore, I ought to give my food to the starving, okay? This is a syllogism, but it's using an ought statement, not an is statement like that's more logically stated there, okay? That ought statement is a tougher way, it's a tougher argument to make because it's a moral argument you're making here. It's not a scientific argument, it's not a mathematical argument. Even though it's a syllogism, which uses our basic logic, it's a moral argument, okay? And that's a tougher position to move to, okay? Because From a pure logic standpoint, you could also rearrange the syllogism as such. Some people in the world are starving. I have more food than I need. Therefore, lucky me. Yay. Eat up. That's still logically correct. But it's not a moral statement there. So the moral statement, as philosopher David Hume said, is a tougher one to move towards. Okay? He said there's a big difference between an is statement and an ought statement. And that's important to sort of realize. By the way, for those of you who are thinking about using ethics in your essays or your presentations, David Hume, excellent source for getting some of this stuff for what you're working on. Okay? So, sure, we're still using reason, and we're looking at the syllogism and going, yeah, it's logically sound, but is it right? Well, now you're moving to a moral position, right? So, does this lead to moral relativism? Well, maybe, okay? But I'm going to tear moral relativism also apart as a position. So the first thing is, if you accept relativism as a position, does that imply tolerance? And here's what I mean by that, okay? If we just say, that's just their culture, that's just what they do in their culture, that tends to sort of make it okay, sort of this live and let live attitude. I know that they're like performing genital mutilation in that country, but you know what, that's just their culture. That implies that we are tolerating what they're doing based on that relativist position, okay? And for some of us that seems bad. That seems wrong in itself, that we are tolerating others' views based just on relativism, okay? Some would argue that this relativism has led to sort of a cultural imperialism, that the opposite of moral relativism is, well, wait a minute. They're not allowed to do genital mutilation. We should invade their country to stop that. Right? And wait a minute, that country over there, they're not a democratic society. So we should invade their country to stop that, because our position is we are morally right, they're morally wrong, and as a result, we're going to take over to show them the light, so to speak. So is that the right way to go? Is that got its own sort of darkness to it as well? It's sort of a tricky, fine line position here. There is no easy answer to moral questions. It's just a matter of sort of coming up with definitions and trying to look at it. And it's hard, okay? So surely it's more reasonable to say that we have our values, they have their values, sure, but we have no right to necessarily condemn their values. Or maybe we do have that right. Do we have the right to condemn a society that performs female genital mutilation? I would argue maybe we do. Others would argue maybe we don't. That's their position and they're allowed to have it. And where's that line between something to the extreme of, say, female genital mutilation to something as simple as, what? They don't allow legalized marijuana? Oh, we should invade them. We should take over that country because that's just morally wrong. Maybe that's too weak of a position to sort of justify that action. But you know what, guys? That kind of stuff happens every single day. Okay. So maybe the antidote to cultural imperialism is this sort of thug-like, is to oppose this thug-like attitude of imposing values of one culture on another. If we say you shouldn't do that, you should not impose your cultural perspective on other cultures, maybe you are a relativist. Maybe you are a moral relativist that believes slightly in that position, okay? But maybe this idea that we should intervene in other cultures that are, for example, slaughtering children or something like that, implies that maybe moral relativism isn't quite going to get me there. I have to modify my position in some ways. Some might even say that the Nazi Germany position was a sense of sort of cultural imperialism that said, well, we have the right way and we're going to show you the right way. And the fact that we did not tolerate that and we opposed Nazi Germany says that we were against moral relativism, because a true moral relativist would have went, oh, well, that's just the Nazis' way. Let them go ahead. They can do what they need to do. A good quote. Okay, let's tear moral relativism apart now, okay? So, two positions to examine, okay? Some might argue that there actually is core values. And David, you kind of had a little bit of that position. You said, you know what? There might be a few values that are universal society to society. Okay? Some might say that things like rules to limit violence, at least rules to limit it, rules to protect your property, and rules to promote honesty have been universal in every society. The actual execution of those rules is different, but just the rules themselves, a basic precept, a basic axiom, a basic starting point might be there. Okay? There is an argument that could be made for that. Okay? But for a lot of our history, people have had no moral concern for outsiders to the group. Okay? Those outside the in-group, those in the out-group, are not considered part of the in-group, and therefore there is no morality as that goes, right? So for example, the Wari tribe of the Amazon classified everyone not in the Wari tribe, their word for it was edible. That's the word they used for people who were not part of the Wari tribe, okay? That might tell you a little bit about their position on people who are not Wari, okay? Maybe, I used to say this about my sister who claimed to be, for a while, claimed to be a vegetarian, except she ate lobster, that she was prejudiced against all the other fish, or against lobsters, that lobsters for some reason had some sort of special category that she put them in. Okay, but I got to move on. If you look through human history, there's definitely some disturbing chapters in that history where moral values did not seem to exist at all in some ways. Okay? But if you were actually part of that society, you might have reclassified that era in a different way, like we were talking about before. Okay. Now, I actually have already asked you guys this question. I said, could you name some? I asked in this question for 5. You guys couldn't come up with more than 3, and I had to help squeeze those out of you guys this morning that are universal values. Just 5. If you had a rule book with 5 rules, said live your life by these 5 rules. Hi.
Anybody home?
Yeah,
There we go.
yeah. Sorry, I'm just.
Can't see you.
Well, I'm teaching. It's okay. Just cut through. It's okay. Okay. So again, 5 rules. Be very difficult to find. Okay. All right. Moving on. So a second reason to oppose relativism is that we can justify our values if we think about it. We can put a justification behind them, okay? We often do. We often say, and you guys did just this morning, well, I'm against that execution thing because killing is wrong. You just put it in place. For some of us, this is intuitively obvious. You just place such a thing right in there, okay? It's as obvious as when you prove something in math when you say 2 + 2 = 4. Why? Because it is, and you walk away. And in some ways, we can do that with some moral positions. Not all moral positions. It's a little more difficult. Okay. Sometimes it then leads to just an appeal to intuition. Like, well, why is it wrong? It just is because I feel it's wrong. And that would be an emotional appeal. And we talked about emotion last year. Okay. We'll wrap up there today. There's been a million interruptions this morning, but that's okay. We'll wrap that this morning. All right, guys, thanks for your attention this morning. I know it was a tough one as always.